All right. Hello. Welcome to Connect with Adult Ed, the NMHED podcast. My name is Nadia and I am your host. Thank you for joining us. Today we have a very special episode where we're talking about accommodations. So just a little header. This originally was a listener email. We sent out a call out to people to give us some questions on what they were having at this time. So it took a pause because the questions were more complicated than we originally thought. And we really had to revamp our original style. And I think we're at a really good place now than when we first started. So I'm pretty excited about it. So I just first want to apologize to those people who did send in these inquiries and who needed help immediately. We apologize, but we're hoping that these questions, as well as the resources that we'll provide from our guests, that this will help moving forward and just be this kind of guideline so that we minimize the kinds of questions that we have right now. So I'm, of course, joined by my sometimes co-host, Jamie. Hey, Jamie. So we're happy to be here. And I want my guests to introduce themselves. So we're with Dené Shelton and Julie Wright. So you guys want to get started? Introduce yourselves.
Sure. So my name is Dené Shelton. I'm a program specialist with the New Mexico Higher Education Department, Adult Education Division, working under Director Dr. Amber Gallup. I have a Master of Fine Arts in Writing from California College of the Arts and a Master of Arts in English, or Rhetoric and Writing specifically, with a pedagogy emphasis from the University of New Mexico. My professional background is in the execution of primarily education and employment-based nonprofit programming and social services provision, including bridge programs, job development, work as a career specialist, education and employment specialist, education specialist, and as a college level and community-based instructor. I'm experienced designing and executing multimodal college level and community-based curriculum, combining professional workforce preparation with autoethnography or personal narrative to invite, include, and address the needs and interests of outsider, at-risk, or underserved communities. So essentially my research in my master's program was personal narrative, the integration of personal experience into putting it at the front of the classroom so that students, rather than hiding themselves away to fit a more dominant academic or professional narrative, supporting them in finding ways to bring their own needs, experiences to the forefront of academic and professional discussions. Student populations I've worked with primarily include women, people of color, inner city youth, gender nonconforming, queer, and LGBT communities, working class students, first generation college students, immigrant population, and English as a second language or ESL students. So just prior to working for the state of New Mexico, which I started a year ago, I was an education specialist with the University of New Mexico Health Sciences Center for Development and Disability, or CDD Information Network, seeing that information hub of the CDD through the COVID-19 crisis, when many of their resources and services had to go online. So I specifically worked with online presentation development, online platforms, online education, and then accessible materials. I delivered presentations, created comprehensive education outreach and marketing materials, and managed a complex database, all toward educating the community on resources for New Mexicans with physical and developmental disabilities. Primarily, their emphasis was on developmental disabilities, particularly resources offered by the CDD itself and those resources that exist across the state.
So you were right. That was a long introduction.
Yeah, I went.
You were like, wow, this is like, when you
it's super long. But you know what I did? I was like, I'm just going to take a minute and be like, this is how I'm qualified to have this conversation. Because I feel like people are confused. Like Matt they all know him. They know they have such a context for him. And for me, they're like, what? Where are you from?
So yes, of course. No, yeah. So referencing Matt Edelin, who is another program specialist with the state. Yeah. No, I get it. So this is your really formal introduction. Go away.
Yes. Yeah. Hi. Yes. That's me. That's everything I've been doing.
Of course, yeah. No, definitely. So, Julie, please introduce yourself.
Okay, here we go. My name is Julie Wright. I'm an ESL citizenship and special educator at Catholic Charities here in Albuquerque. I come from the K-12 world, so that my first 10 years of being an educator, I taught middle school, the trifecta that I heard, the middle school math, special ed. So that was fun. I enjoyed it completely. I have my master's degree in education from Roberts Wesleyan University in Rochester, New York. And I also run Endurance Tutoring and Consulting LLC, where I'm an executive functioning tutor and coach for children, teens, and adults with executive functioning struggles. My interest in executive functioning began when my son was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, which isn't even a diagnosis anymore, when he was 11. And that was his main issue, that he had executive functioning challenges. I had no idea what that was. It encouraged me to get my master's degree because there was not a lot of help for him. So I decided I'm going to help people with this. So what I've been doing in the past 16 years is helping students of all ages build executive skills. I've also offered training for parents and fellow educators.
Excellent. Oh, cool. Okay. Wow. Okay. So this is very personal for you, Julie.
It is. I'm an educator and a parent. It's very personal. And through my experience, I can see both sides. So when I speak with parents, I really understand where they're coming from because I've been there. I've done the 24/7 of this myself. So
yes. And I just also want to emphasize that we are all masters. We all have master's degrees. So, of course, Dené's dual and an MFA. I don't know if people know that an MFA is what they call a terminal degree. I don't know if that's still the phrase, but what that means is that's the highest level of fine arts. Like you can't really get a PhD in like painting, like stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So you get an MFA. So we are all masters. We are all masters of knowledge here, and we bring really different stuff to the table. It's very exciting.
And I also just want to say, and I was talking to Director Gallup about this morning, how much the case is that parents who are navigating systems, in advocacy for children with developmental disabilities, learning differences, et cetera, they do actually become experts in the field. I think that it can be, that's just a parent, that person, whether or not they're credentialed, that there can be a dismissive attitude regarding the breadth of knowledge that parents have when they're navigating these systems. But over a long period of time, given the complexity, they do become experts in the field, even if it's particular to their children's learning difference or disability. When I worked for the CDD, we actually hired a physician in our office. And one of the things that made this an ideal fit was that the person was a parent of children with disabilities and had navigated the system from that perspective. And then they were able to almost act as like a peer advocate role. It was like a family specialist role. And the woman that filled that position, she was extraordinary, her breadth of knowledge.
We have to learn it. It's really important when it's your child, definitely.
Yeah, there's lots of ways to be qualified.
Absolutely.
Thank you. So let's jump in to our questions. So just to reiterate, of course, we're using the questions that were originally sent to us because these are directly from practitioners in the state of New Mexico and had these questions about working with neurodivergent students and students with diagnosed and undiagnosed disability, right? So the first question is, what can we do when we know a student is neurodivergent due to presented and submitted IEP or diagnosis paperwork, but is denied accommodations in the classroom, not just at testing, either due to teacher negligence or inability to meet the accommodation due to the lack of experience, training, supplies, or program support? How can we troubleshoot to improve this experience?
This is complex, this question, so I'll try to unpack it as much as I can. It does depend on what context we're talking about. So for example, if it's in your AE classroom or AEL classroom, and what I mean when I say AEL is Adult Education and Literacy classroom, if you or your fellow instructor has denied a reasonable accommodation, then that's something that you would address directly And then if it happens somewhere else, you would refer the student to resources for pursuing a grievance. I probably should have started with this, but this is a potential ADA violation. Institutions should have supports and policies in place for students. Programs not tied to institutions should have internal policies. So a lot of adult education and literacy programs in the state of New Mexico are housed within community college systems or university systems. And so they would abide by the policies within those systems. However, if they're a nonprofit, then it's important, again, that they create policies and they can mirror the policies they create on their local institution. It's important that staff and students are aware of the complaint process. It's actually a requirement of adult education and literacy programs to have a formalized grievance process in the case that this occurs. And students can be referred to disability support services. And if they're referred somewhere, then that referral doesn't mean that the adult education instructors cease to serve the student. You would continue to provide instruction, education, support, the service, essentially, and accommodate the student's needs, even if they are referred somewhere else. So it's not like a student has a complaint and then you stop serving them. It's the opposite. You make sure that they have the information necessary to know how to start a grievance process or to make a complaint, and then you continue to support them. It's absolutely essential that we support our students around their disabilities, learning differences, neurodivergence included. And in the case where a student has provided documentation and requested a formal accommodation and you cannot meet that accommodation, then you would go through an undue hardship process. So providers are required to accommodate students with learning differences and disabilities. However, if it presents a significant undue burden, such as a significant, financial hardship, etc., then they have to formally respond in writing, prove the financial hardship, and then brainstorm next steps or come up with next steps. So again, each program is required to have an established grievance policy and provide that to students. It's really important as instructors that you know your institution's policy, know where institutional and local resources are, and provide that information to your students. And also make sure that your students are able to access those resources. I know that in some community college systems or university systems, there's been issues around like non-credit students maybe not having access to the same institutional resources as credit students. Make sure you know what they actually have access to, what your adult education students have access to. And then if they don't, then find resources that are accessible to them, provide them with those resources.
I'm coming from the instructor lens, okay? And one of the things that's really important, because a lot of these questions have been centered around neurodivergence, so I wanted to define that for you. This definition comes from the Cleveland Clinic. It's pretty basic, but I think it's a good one. Neurodivergent means it's a non-medical term that describes people whose brains develop or work differently for some reason. This means that the person has different strengths and struggles from people whose brains develop or work more typically. Conditions a person with neurodivergence can have include ASD, which is autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, dyslexia, dyspraxia, intellectual disabilities, sensory processing disorder, social anxiety disorder, and mental health conditions like bipolar disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder. Now that's a lot. It might seem overwhelming. And when you have students in your classroom, what I want you to remember is you cannot tell by looking at someone whether or not they're neurodivergent. Some people come to us with basically trauma around their past education experiences. They possibly weren't treated well because they have an undiagnosed disability. Maybe they were not treated well because they have a disability and they don't choose to disclose that anymore. Either way, our goal as educators are to meet the needs of our learners. We need to meet them where they are now. And we have to recognize that neurodivergence exists, that we could have students in our classroom that have these conditions, but we should make sure we're managing our classroom and design our instruction in a way that accommodates all learners. Throughout these questions, I will be giving you examples on strategies on how to do that. But keep in mind, connection is going to be our best defense against making sure that people aren't rejected any longer in their education journey. They're here, we're excited that they're here, and we want to help them reach their goals and get to the next stage of their life.
And the sort of legalities in place around this, it's the same message. You know, the right of a learner with disabilities of any kind is to a reasonable accommodation for courses and examinations. So we want to lean toward accommodating the student.
Absolutely. Thank you both for your very thorough and nuanced responses. I really appreciate the two lenses here, because what we're talking about, we are talking about at the program policy level, which is, that's leadership, that's administrative. And then we're talking about also in the classroom. These two different types of roles really do need to work together on this. We can't really be siloed. So the next question, I am working closely with a student who suspects she has a learning disability, her words, such as dyslexia or maybe another executive functioning disorder. We've given her information to seek out an eval from a clinician, but she hasn't reached out to them. Is there anything else I can or should do?
Well, I want to start by saying that self-identification is valid. It doesn't necessarily lead to formal or official accommodations, but it allows the instructor to modify their classroom to address the student's needs, that student's need and the whole classroom, anyone who might have that specific need in the classroom. So when a student suspects something, when they use a specific type of language, while this might not be like a formal diagnosis per se, it lets you know that there's a need here. And what's most important, in this scenario is to meet the need. Now, when it comes to students, their own process around getting a diagnosis, that's really complex. And so it's not up to us to diagnose or to push diagnosis. We can provide information. In this case, a student, has disclosed suspicion of a specific learning difference or challenge. And so you can give her the information, but you can't push or force. This is a personal journey, and with adult students, this is their own road to walk. And it's not easy for everyone. There's a lot that comes into play for students, including like academic trauma, including shaming, maybe when this stuff showed up in their educational history. Fear of failure or issues around success, maybe a history of difficulty with the medical or establishment, maybe misdiagnosis, even like cultural perceptions of things like dyslexia. So that's a road for them to walk. You provide support, but what's most important, as we mentioned before, is making sure that you're addressing what the student's need is in the classroom. Again, you respect the student's decision, provide the information, and support them. I recommend that all AE educators have a very solid list of referrals that they provide to students upon intake or orientation, on the syllabus, and throughout the program. And you can refer back to it. If anyone has questions about this or if anyone is concerned about this, you can mention it and you can refer back to the resource list. You can follow up and ask, have you thought about contacting that resource? But you can't push, really. You don't want to cross a line where the student becomes uncomfortable with you as an instructor. And the kinds of questions you can ask are like, what do you find helpful? What have you found helpful in the past? And then you just adjust the whole classroom approach to accommodate that, because you want to be careful also of singling out an individual student. So when you provide an accommodation or an adjustment to your classroom approach, you wouldn't just do it for that one student, because you could potentially out them. as having a learning difference, or you could kind of alienate them. So you want to take a whole classroom approach to that.
Another thing that I've seen in the classroom with students that I've worked with who don't choose to identify, even if they do have accommodations, they don't see that working for them. For instance, if you have someone who doesn't like to be the center of attention, telling them it's a good idea to sit in the front of the room is stressful, and they're not going to do it. So my approach is always looking at my class. I don't want any instructor to think, oh no, this person won't get an official diagnosis. What am I going to do? And have your instruction be frozen because you don't know what to do for this person. So it's a better approach would be to develop accommodations for the entire class, knowing what that one student needs. And chances are other people might need. This is where executive functioning comes in. Let me give you the definition of that. Executive skills, and one of the things I want to tell you too, recently, I've been researching executive functioning for actually 18 years now, starting from when my son was diagnosed. The names always change. Now I'm hearing more people talk about executive skills. So when you're looking that up, you can do either or, and the information will come up. Executive skills refer to the brain-based cognitive processes that help us to regulate our behavior, make decisions, and set and achieve goals. This definition is from Dr. Peg Dawson. I use her information a lot. She wrote the book called Smart But Scattered, and she works mostly with children and teens, but she's done a couple. I've seen a seminar with her where she talks about adults, and she says, we talk about how everybody has executive skills that they're working on. So these skills include response inhibition, working memory, emotional control, task initiation, sustained attention, planning and prioritizing, organization, time management, flexibility, metacognition, goal-directed persistence, and stress tolerance. Now that's a lot of information. Everybody has strengths and weaknesses with these skills, whether you're neurodivergent or neurotypical. So that's why you can use this in your classroom. There's actually executive functioning scales you can use to determine specifically what strengths and weaknesses people have. And what I like to do when I know individually, I like to use the strengths to build up the weaknesses. If you take same Dr. Peg Dawson's executive functioning scale, I've done it on myself. She suggests couples doing it together because you'll find often that the opposites attract thing really is the key. A lot of times one partner's weaknesses are the other one's strengths, and that's why they work so well together. So you can use that in the classroom. You might have students that have different strengths and weaknesses. And if you know that, that's how you can pair students when you're doing think, pair, share, or when you're doing group work. So as far as some strategies, there's so many, but in the classroom, you can do, if someone is having a hard time with stress tolerance, for instance, I do this with all of my classes, whether people have stress tolerance issues or not. I send my objectives and agenda ahead of time to my students so they know what to expect. This is what we're going over today in class, or, in 2 days. I usually try to give them 2 days so they have time to look at it. I also post them when I'm in person. I post them in the class or online. I make sure that they see that document at least once, and I oftentimes go back to it during class. There is also a task initiation strategy. So someone who's having a really hard time getting started, brainstorming works really well. That's another thing you can do with the entire class, and everybody's going to benefit from that. More than one brain works better, right? So that can help when you're starting a project. If you are already using these strategies, you are already building executive skills in your students. So congratulations to you. And there will be more that, you'll learn about throughout this podcast. But also, if you have specific questions, my email will be on the resources. Feel free to email me and we can go over specific cases for your students.
Excellent. Thank you both for that. I also just wanted to add something that's been on my mind lately with this. The emphasis that our students are adults. There are programs that serve teenagers, like 16 and up. And I understand that 16-year-olds to 18 have very different needs as opposed to adults. But I think that the thing that we want to focus on here is that you still have to hold them accountable and you still have to treat them as adults. You can't parent these kids, like, even though sometimes it feels like we kind of get into weird places with that. So that's when we're talking about adults, we are talking about 16 and older here. So those are the people that we serve in New Mexico. So
that's a good point, Nadia, because one of the things that's another reason why I focus on building executive skills, because when you're building, along with the skills, you're building confidence and you're bringing people to the edge of their own learning so they become lifelong learners and they take it over when they're not seeing you anymore. It's really neat to see when that comes to fruition.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I was thinking about that actually on my way into work this morning, how we hadn't really talked about that too much. And we do serve people 16 and older, but the context here I think is important. They're in adult education environments. They're in adult contexts. Students who don't graduate high school but choose to take high school equivalency can get a parent waiver to take it early. That's an example. And so they're pursuing adult learning. The context, I think, is important to consider here. They're in an adult environment that is tailored toward adult learning rather than being in a public school system or a K through 12 environment. And so it is how you address those two environments is different. And treating them as adults within that context is, I think, very important.
Yeah, absolutely. I just feel like I'm thinking anecdotally, it does come up.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the thing that comes up, honestly, behavioral issues. And it's like, well, you have to treat them like adults. So you have to hold them accountable just like everyone else. So let's keep moving. So this question does hit kind of the same points as the previous question. So if a student does not have accommodations and expresses that they do not want to formally seek accommodations, what do you recommend doing? I want to do what I can to support everyone's learning, but I don't always know how.
Again, it's up to a student to self-disclose and to choose accommodations, to request accommodations, to pursue that process. It's entirely up to the student. You want to respect whatever the decision is that they make. If they're having difficulty executing coursework, then you can have a further conversation with the student, but it's important to remember that the decision is ultimately the student's. Something to keep in mind is that you're in this context where, we're talking to adult education and literacy instructors, staff, and directors, and you're not here to diagnose or to necessarily suggest or push for a diagnosis. Again, that's their journey, and you're here to make your classroom as inclusive and as accommodating as possible. As an instructor, it's really important, and in order to best serve your students and to create inclusive classrooms, to become as educated as possible on developmental disabilities, learning differences, and neurodivergence. So educate yourself not to diagnose, but to create inclusive classrooms and to best serve your students. And some examples of resources for this are Do IT or Do It Profiler and Neurodiversity 101, which will be included in the resource list for this podcast. You can also look at information at your local institutions. Again, not to to be redundant, but like UNM, CNM, NMSU, you can look at both their policies and information that they provide as far as services to students.
I just wanted to add, it's just a reminder of like, this is more than an individual thing. Like I know teachers in their classrooms, like that's their domain, but this kind of stuff, especially with students, it really is program wide. So you guys have to like really, this could be something that comes up. It's just really maybe bring this up during a staff meeting or something. It's just like, what are we looking at? How are we supporting our students as a whole? Because you also don't want to get into a position where one student is having a radically different experience from one classroom to the next. That definitely happens based on the environment, like the experience of this instructor, what tools that they have. So like this needs to be like a shared knowledge here. So Julie, please, I just wanted to add that. But Julie,
that's a perfect segue to what I was going to say. We need to make sure, putting this question, I'm going to put on my instructor and coach hat. There are things you can do. First of all, there are environmental accommodations that you can have in your classroom. The main goal here, again, is that you don't want anyone to know that any of their peers has a disability. So you can impose this on your entire classroom, right? So environmental accommodations include things like building in breaks, But not just breaks. Adults need breaks, right? Especially when they're learning a bunch of different things. I'm thinking of GED classes where they're learning 4 different content areas within a couple hours and having to transition from one to another. That's very hard for some people to do. So build in little breaks, but also let your students know when these breaks are going to occur so they can plan for that. It is not a good idea to spring things on people who have neurodivergence. They just don't like it. And that's okay. A lot of people are like that don't have neurodivergence, right? So let people know. Another example would be shortening tasks. And it could just be for that person or taking them aside and saying, if they're saying that they're having trouble with this one content area of homework, I want you to do this amount because this is the part that really lets me know that you understand the material. Offering choices. You can build in choices to your instruction, different ways of presenting the material, and people get to choose which way they complete the assignment. And most importantly, I've mentioned this before, giving advance notice when the schedule changes. Giving advance notice in general is just a really good habit to be in. And if every instructor did that, I think we would see a big change in your classroom management needs. Basically, always, I'm going to say this probably for every question, but developing connection with your class is the most important thing that you can take away here. It offers you the ability to differentiate in your class. When you know what the needs are of the people in your classroom, then you know how to differentiate. I often do like kind of a group interview at the beginning, and I do it often every couple weeks at the beginning, because the first day, there are many people who don't want to speak at all. But then we start going and we kind of become a family in my class. So then they start speaking, even though I had a student who was NRS level 1 by the end of the semester, she was a 3. Because of things like that, we really, really connected as a class. And all of these people in this class are currently still friends. They get together all the time and they're practicing English that way. So it's really, really does benefit the entire class by treating the class, by not singling people out in your class.
Thank you for that.
I want to take a moment to clarify language just a little bit. Like we use accommodation like pretty much across the board to talk about anything we're doing to sort of alter, change, or update a classroom to meet student needs. But there is a difference between a classroom intervention and a formal accommodation. And I think that it can trip teachers up because they can get nervous thinking what they might be providing is an intervention. And they're thinking of it as an accommodation and like, oh, I have to go through a formal process and document this. And they start to get nervous about the complexity of it, of the requirements of it. However, teachers are free to execute interventions at their own discretion. And that's primarily, a lot of this is what we're talking about. Just to define it, intervention is a strategy or technique such as color coding, card markers, colored overlays, etc. Classroom interventions can be provided at any time, at the instructor's discretion, and indicate inclusive and classroom-specific teaching methodology. Interventions do not require formal process, documentation, or procedure. However, the AEL program may benefit from documentation for pedagogical purposes and efficiency in instruction. So, for example, it would be smart if you've changed your classroom instruction or made changes to your classroom, or, in essence, you've added some interventions in your classroom, you might want to document it and then share it, as Nadia was talking about, in a shared knowledge capacity, and have it be best practice that you use across the board in your program and across programs. Accommodation changes or augments the environment to enable individuals to complete or perform at an equal level. It provides ways in which an individual can be assisted to maximize his or her potential, and accommodation does not perform the task. I'm not going to get too far into that because it's very formal sounding, but an accommodation is you go through a formal process. There's a request put in, the student discloses closes, there's a request, documentation is provided if necessary. The teacher or the program or the classroom, however you want to say it, provides the accommodation, or if they can't, gives documentation of undue hardship, and then problem solves, how the students' needs can be met. So there's kind of this big spectrum between like Matt gave me an example yesterday where he just printed every single student's test or document for the class on green paper because he had a sense that certain students might have some challenges that would be improved by that. And that's an intervention. It does not out any specific student. It doesn't require a formal process, and it's whole classroom. So if there's a benefit to be had there, the whole classroom got it. And that's like an example of an intervention. So a large portion of what we're talking about is interventions that instructors can make to address the needs of their students.
In executive functioning, though, because there's like outside, it's not just all school, you can use all of those environmental accommodations in that way. So that's very typical when we're talking about executive functioning, because it's not just academic. Coaches use or build executive functioning skills outside of the classroom to help inside the classroom. So the lines are a little bit blurred there because of the intent, I think.
So you think it's like it changes up a little bit depending on context, like where and how it's being
If you're
executed
just
and what type
talking about
of
the classroom,
population?
I would say yes. But because of our population, they're needing a typical accommodation is sitting in the front of the room. I don't want that. A lot of people will tell you, I don't want to be the center of attention. That's not going to work for me. So then what do you do? Do nothing? No. You do a different accommodation. And sometimes you have to create it because it's not already official.
My first instinct would be, just from what your example would be, not even do front or back, do like a circle, change your desks around.
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
That's what you can do.
That's great.
Yeah.
Move like where you are as the teacher. Like maybe you're in the middle of the room.
Right.
Maybe you have a rolling whiteboard. You just move that, or like, that's just for examples.
See, and that seems like an intervention to me. So I think that maybe a way to say it is that we can call this stuff interventions, but if there's a formal process being pursued, you call it an accommodation. There's obviously a gray area with the language for different people in different contexts.
When I think of accommodation, though, I really do think of it as formal. Like I think of it just directly because, my teaching experience, I would think of it as you get extra time when you take the TABE test. That's
correct. Yes.
Whereas like not every
accommodation.
Right. That's what I'm thinking when you use those terms. I'm like, oh, okay. Like I had a student who just needed more time. So, and they had this kind of documentation. So they got more time than some of the other students. And it actually ended up working better for them. They were just a slow processor. It happens, This is complicated, but it's very interesting. And I think
it's also a lot of people still don't understand the extent of teaching executive skills can help. And that's the language they use in those circles. That's why.
Oh, that's really interesting. Because the way that because we've been using it throughout, and I'm like, this is an intervention. I've thought that a couple of times, like this is informal. This is something that you could do without, you don't even have to document it. It's like making an adjustment to the whole room. And I worry a little bit that like instructors, this is something that they get confused about. Definitely. And I feel like
but they also
showing up in questions.
Intervention as a behavioral word too. That's how, as an educator, usually intervention denotes there's a behavior problem.
Okay.
I don't think we need to get too hung up on the words. We can talk about this all day. Basically, I'm responding to the questions that are being asked.
Yeah. No, of course.
With their wording, because that's how they understand it, meeting them where they are.
Okay. In the policy document that we're putting forward, in the guidebook that we're putting forward, we're clearly delineating the difference between those two things.
So then
just
everybody
FYI. So it's why I brought it up, because it's going to show up here later that the intervention versus accommodation are two different things, and there's examples given. I don't know that we have to unpack it necessarily here, but I think it's important to mention that the language, there's more to the language maybe than the way that we're using it so far.
Yeah. I think just in turn, this is where it is tricky, but I think just because a part of this is we're giving the guidelines to programs and we're making this assumption that they're going to, implement using those guidelines. I think we should stick to that just because it's a statewide. Yeah, but I could see where it does get a little confusing. But it's a good point.
Yeah. In the current draft, that is going to be, there's a specific section for that where it says intervention versus accommodation. And the end game there is to help instructors relax. So, when they're going through a process of getting it, applying for a formal accommodation, for going through an informal accommodation process for a student, that's called an accommodation. You would use that language. But when they're making changes in their classroom, they're not required to do the same thing. And those are called interventions. And that's how it's going to be put forward in the materials that we'll provide. So just for you guys, if you just take it completely out of the podcast, that's fine. But for your knowledge, and I felt like I should say something because it's going to show up.
I do want to say, though, that it's just a good point because Julie gave a perfect example of that, of because our practitioners are coming from so many different areas, particularly, I think, for example, literacy and HSC, so many different just backgrounds. We're going to be using different language. So part of this policy, this guideline document is shared language.
Yes. So in question 3, I think it particularly is noticeable for me because it says if a student does not have accommodations and they said they don't want to formally seek them, and what I would say here is you do classroom interventions. However, if you're in Julie's context, what is that, behavioral, you were saying?
Yeah. Some people do that behavioral.
You can see how it gets confusing. But I would use I would say, okay, then do institute classroom interventions is what I would
And let's face it, the terminology has changed so much. When I mentioned my son was diagnosed with Asperger's, I mentioned that to someone even 5 years ago, and they got mad at me because I didn't know that wasn't a diagnosis anymore.
It still happened. It's not like it didn't. It's just that it's an old-fashioned term.
And people self-identify as having Asperger's because that's what they were diagnosed with. That's what they were diagnosed. That was utilized. Yeah.
Right. So I think there's a difference, though, between getting mad about it and just being oh, this is different language. It's just for me, it's very odd. Why are you getting mad about something like that? But there's a difference between calling someone out and being this is what I was diagnosed with and this is how I identify. That's different. Anyway, let's get into it.
It is a hot topic, though. It was at the CDD. You never use the term Asperger's. It was so that is
Hans did some really horrible things to these people. That's why. Yeah. So, which is not something we need to get into, but you can definitely look that up. It's not that hard.
I read the book. Oh my God, it was horrifying. Yeah,
Nazi stuff isn't great. So anyway, let's get into it. This interview will continue on the next part of this episode. Thank you for listening to the NMHED podcast. Connect with Adult Ed, the NMHED podcast, is a project of the Propel Professional Learning System and is funded by the New Mexico Higher Education Department's Adult Education Division. Thank you for listening.